If you're using glutamine like most people, whether it's for recovery, bodybuilding, athletic performance, you're missing out on huge potential. I'll show you how to fix that using 5 quick tips for how to take glutamine based not just on the research, but my own lab research. We'll talk about one of the biggest myths about glutamine. You believe it right now, it's going to fundamentally change the way you look at this ingredient. Cover one of the most embarrassing experiences I had in my early research career, how it impacted glutamine, and I think it's going to benefit you as well. And at the end, as always, I'll show you how I do it with my clients and athletes. We've got a lot to cover. Let's get right to it.
3, 2, 1.
I'm David Barr. If you're looking to get bigger, faster, stronger, get leaner, go longer, hit that subscribe and then the little bell so you don't miss the latest updates. And I'm going to one-up it because if you think that objective evidence is a better way to establish truth compared to special feelings the way most people do it, you definitely want to share this video, share this information, help advance the conversation. Now, this one kicked off around the turn of the century. I was presenting at the American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM annual conference, and after hours we were blowing off steam at a local pub, talking to some fellow research meatheads, guys who lifted, talking about supplements. So this was an awesome conversation. And we started talking about the basics, like creatine, how effective it was. And again, around the turn of the century, this was still relatively new. But when it came to glutamine as something I thought was a basic, I thought was rock solid, again, there wasn't a lot going on around the turn of the century. There wasn't a lot available the way there is today. And the researchers had actually performed research on glutamine. They had actually studied this in healthy adults with resistance training. Now, this is mind-blowing because most of the research we had at the time was all using surrogate research. It was using sick people, it was using animals or cells. This is all surrogate research. It's not the best, highest fidelity research that we have. It's not till we get into healthy humans who are resistance training, long-term studies. That's where it gets exciting because that's where the theory starts to get a higher fidelity result. Now, I love theory, I use it myself, we'll use it in this video, but once you have the higher level result, that higher level, higher fidelity answer, that's what we have to go by. We don't go backwards and start going to animal research once we have human data established, right? So we stick with the best evidence that we have. It's not dogma, but it's the best evidence that we have. So what these guys told me, much to my dismay, was that glutamine just didn't work. It didn't have any effect on anabolism, body composition, muscle growth, strength, that kind of thing. And this is where it gets weird. This is where something odd happened. I got pissed off. After a few days, I calmed down. I tried to figure out what was going on. I mean, think about it. These guys had just given me cutting edge research. I was one of the first glutamine users on the planet to get this cutting edge info. It was going to impact how I was going to use glutamine. But I got pissed off. What was going on? This is bizarre. I mean, I should have been thankful, right? I should have been excited. I should have been spreading the word and emailing them, telling them thank you and how grateful I am for gifting me with this information. But I got pissed off. And it wasn't until sometime later that I realized it's a psychological phenomenon that we have, that all humans have. It's called shoot the messenger. And you've probably heard of this before as a general concept. I didn't know it was an actual psychological phenomenon. This was crazy to me. And I was experiencing it because we all experience this stuff. It's part of the mental gymnastics that we go through, the tricks that our psychology plays on us in order to hold on to a pre-existing belief. And it's very, very strong when that pre-existing belief is positive, when it's a desirable effect. So supplements, I mean, this is a fantastic phenomenon that I've come to experience for nearly 2 decades now. Getting hate mail in response to people reading one of my lit reviews, hearing about one of my lit reviews, showing that a supplement or ingredient lacks efficacy, lacks effectiveness. The initial reaction is going to be anger. Why? It's that shoot the messenger syndrome. If we can hate the individual giving the information, then we don't have to believe what they say, and then we can hang on to that pre-existing desirable belief. It sounds crazy, but it's what we do. It's just human psychology. So the key is to notice if you are having an emotional reaction to information, that's a very important first step to critical thinking. Just understanding and acknowledging that initial emotional reaction. It's not always easy to do because we're in the throes of that emotional reaction. But if we can pay attention to it, then we can start to see that there's more at play here than just this information being incorrect. It's our psychology playing tricks on us. Again, totally human, totally natural. It's just something we need to work against so we have a better conversation, help advance the conversation. So over the next year or so, I compiled more and more research on glutamine. I did a deep dive into this stuff to really see what was going on with the theory versus application. And it turns out that all of the theories that had been set up were knocked down like dominoes by newer, higher fidelity research. I mean, we had immunity, we had glycogen restoration, we had anabolism, or that anabolic effect that we were so excited about when it came to glutamine supplementation. All of that just fell by the wayside. It showed that, great, we had the theory and that was important, but it just didn't work. Now, I put about 50 hours into this lit review that I didn't really know what to do with, because at the time, you have to imagine around the turn of the century, you gotta set the stage. It was a different world. It wasn't that long ago, but it really was a different world because, I mean, I'm recording this on a mobile phone right now. We didn't have mobile devices, okay? They were just phones and they weren't as ubiquitous as they are today, okay? They were relatively rare. Now everybody's got one, right? I mean, how many people can you think of who don't have one? Well, at the time, it was more like how many people actually have one of these things. And they sure as hell didn't have anything like cameras. I mean, like an actual digital camera, that's crazy. A video camera? No way. So now you can imagine the environment of the interwebs at the time. I mean, there weren't even blogs at the time. People didn't have personal websites. There were only commercial websites. There was no social media for sharing. There was no YouTube. I mean, imagine a world without YouTube now. It's not that far off. It wasn't that long ago, but that was the world we're living in. It was still relatively constrained, even though it was profoundly different from even 10 years before that, relatively constrained compared to now. So the fundamental problem, I have this lit review showing that glutamine doesn't work for what it was claimed to do. Where do I publish this thing? Because we only had commercial websites and they all sold supplements. And because glutamine was thought to be rock solid, everyone sold it. So who's going to publish a lit review saying, hey, wait, the theory was wrong. You know, it was great as theory, but now that we have higher fidelity information, we know that it's just not accurate. Okay, glutamine doesn't do what we wanted it to do. Who's going to publish that? I mean, it's going to hurt sales, right? And that's a story that persists to this day. This is why the supplement industry is just rife with hyperbole and nonsense, because nobody's going to publish the real research. It's going to hurt sales. It's just business, quote unquote. Now, I happened to find the one bodybuilding website that didn't directly sell glutamine. They sold their own product line. That product line goes under the name Biotest, and the website was TNation. You know it as TNation. At the time, it was testosterone.net. And if you remember that from back in the day, leave me a comment below because I want to hear from you. This is old school stuff. Now, Biotest did have a product called Surge at the time that included glutamine, but at the time they were more interested in having higher fidelity, cutting edge information than potentially hurting a sale. Okay, so huge respect to them for that. I mean, they were the first to do this. This was a 2-part massive lit review. And to my knowledge, this was the first ever published lit review on a bodybuilding site online that was negative, that showed a supplement ingredient didn't work. Because again, if we're only talking commercial websites, then they're all going to sell the products and they're only going to put out the positive information. So this was the first time you have something that's going to be read by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, showing that an ingredient didn't work. And it's common today. It's hard to imagine that. It's like no social media. I mean, imagine that. It's absolutely bizarre. But it was crazy at the time. It had never been done before. And I was expecting adulation. I was expecting thanks. I was expecting ticker tape parades, maybe not out of the question. And what I got was very different. I got hate mail. Why did I got hate mail? Well, this comes back to what happened to me. I don't know why I was expecting anything different. It was the shoot the messenger syndrome. people were pissed off that I was taking away their glutamine. Even though they didn't have it to begin with, it was the perception of having it, right? Perception's everything, unfortunately, especially when it comes to psychology. So this is one of those things, people did not like this. It had never been done before. People had never seen this. Why are you taking away my supplement? You suck. I know it works. It wasn't the placebo effect. I actually felt it. I mean, just every sort of mental gymnastics that we can come up with to try to adhere to this pre-existing belief. Very powerful psychological processes behind this. And again, I experienced this myself. I'm not pointing fingers, right? Like, that's the whole point of the story, is to show I experienced this myself, and we all do. It's one of those things we just need to be aware of and then react accordingly. Now consider, if you've had success in changing body composition, strength, whatever, and you happen to be using glutamine, that's fantastic, that's exciting. No one can take that away from you. In fact, I would submit you're not giving yourself enough credit, because the results are because of you, because of your hard work and dedication, not because of the supplement. Now I'm going to show us how to fix it, but it's important that if you're experiencing that shoot the messenger syndrome, as most of us do, it's okay. I'm not taking your results away from you. You should be proud of those, and you should give yourself the due credit. But at the same time, I'm going to show you how I think we can fix glutamine. This is extrapolated theory. It's not dogma, but I've used it with a couple other ingredients with great success, and I think it also works with glutamine. Now, quick sidebar with regard to the surrogate research. A lot of people invoke burn research when it comes to the efficacy of glutamine. Okay, look, this bullshit has to stop. As the person that you know who has firsthand clinical research experience with severe burn victims, it's got to stop. Severe burns is about the most trauma a human body can go through and then survive for another 50, 60 years. It's about the most catabolic we can be and survive. Okay, I mean, consider, it has to be pretty extreme if we're giving kids anabolic steroids. Okay, so this is not a situation that's going to apply to you, hopefully. Really, really hopefully. But it's not something it's not research that we can use. We can't extrapolate this research. Now, I know, having just said anabolic steroids, some meathead's gonna go, oh, cool, I want to use juice too, so obviously glutamine applies to me. It doesn't work that way. And if you don't get it past that, then I got nothing for you. Just go to another channel. Now, part of the response when I published the lit review on TNation was another supplement site actually came out and published a rebuttal. What they did was they indicated that there were plenty of studies showing the benefits of glutamine. They went to PubMed and they copied and pasted the first page of results when typing in glutamine. Now, these results had nothing to do with muscle, with fat loss, with performance. In fact, most didn't even have to do with humans. Okay, they were other species, not even like rats. I mean, we're talking other archaea species, things that are in no way related to humans. Okay, but they just copied and pasted the first page, slapped it up on their site and said, hey, look at all these studies on glutamine. Okay, cool. Glutamine happened to be a search term, but it doesn't mean they actually used glutamine in the studies. And again, it wasn't even close to humans. But then one of the cronies jumped on and was like, hey, look at all those studies on glutamine. Obviously, his stuff is awesome. This guy's a jerk for saying it doesn't work. Well, I mean, okay, there's so many things wrong with it, including the fact that I'm not just saying it doesn't work. I'm just presenting the best evidence that it doesn't work. And from there, you can make up your own mind, so it's one of those things. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. In fact, I'm trying to show you how to help it, maybe save you some money at the same time. But wow, this was a bizarre response. It's also important and very rare to declare conflicts of interest. And unfortunately, I don't make any money off supplements. I'm just not smart enough to do it. I don't have any vested interest in glutamine supplement companies, anything like that. Good luck finding that elsewhere on YouTube on a legit supplement review. Now, a quick sidebar about that early glutamine research that I learned about in Baltimore back in the day. It turns out to be a landmark study, Kando and colleagues, 2001. I mean, this thing was awesome. They not only use strength training in glutamine, they use massive doses of glutamine. Now, at the turn of the century, this stuff was expensive. Okay, if we were talking like 5 grams a day, everybody was like, oh my God, that's really expensive. I'll only use it on really hard training days. This study used 40 grams of glutamine a day, 40. Okay, that's just absolutely insane. No one could even afford that at the time. So the fact that 40 grams a day, or it's the equivalent of 40 grams a day, and it showed nothing, that was very, very powerful. And again, very, very hard pill to swallow as somebody who was spending money on glutamine at the time. And it's interesting that many years later, you can see almost real time people changing their minds. You can look at, there's a thread on bodybuilding.com. There's just this really hardcore glutamine believer. He swears it works, he knows it works, that kind of thing. And he comes back a year later and says, oh yeah, I get it now, it was just placebo effect. But he had such a powerful emotional response at the time. It actually affects people, it actually influences people. So it's one of those things we need to be careful of, especially when we're reading reviews from other people who claim to be using an ingredient. The placebo effect typically dies off within a month or two at most. That's my personal experience. Within 6 months, it's almost completely gone. And look back 20 years, how many people are using glutamine for the past 20 years? I mean, it just doesn't happen. And yes, there's going to be some assholes who jump on the comments. So I've been using, sure man, whatever. It's not a big deal. Of the million people who have used it, pretty much no one's using it, okay? So that's a great indicator of how effective a product or an ingredient is. We can have super exciting, special feelings about it when we first start. It's motivating, it's exciting. I get it, I'm human too. I get the same thing. But from experience, we just need to know what that is, what it means, and okay, we can have fun for a little bit, but it's not a real effect. It's not something that's going to carry through for our multi-month, multi-year training program. And again, I'm not taking it away from you. If you don't really care, if you just like using glutamine, just use it. I mean, it's not harmful to anything other than your pocketbook. So who cares? Just do what you like. Again, I'm just trying to give you the best information with which to make a decision. Now, I do want to know, if you are using glutamine, what are you using it for? Are you using it for recovery, bodybuilding, muscle growth, athletic performance? Let me know in the comments below. I really want to hear about this. Okay, the myth of the day. This is a big one. You believe it right now, but it's going to change. And the reason you believe it is because it's true, but not in the way that we typically think about it. The myth is glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in muscle, and this one line has sold more glutamine than any other line about this stuff. Okay, this is very, very impactful. It's a very powerful marketing technique, but there's a trick to it, and this is why it's a myth. Now, when we think of what's in muscle, we're thinking muscle structural proteins, right? Actin, myosin, titin, nebulin, all that good stuff, right? So if glutamine is the most important component because it's the most abundant, then obviously we should supplement with it, right? Well, it doesn't work that way, because it turns out that in terms of structural proteins, glutamine is the 4th lowest in abundance, lowest. Okay, I discovered this during my protein synthesis research. It's published in a now $300 textbook put out by my advisors at the time. This thing's crazy, but going from what we think is the most abundant to the 4th lowest, and caveat, they didn't look at selenocysteine at the time, so that could be in there as well. But it's one of those things, it really needs to change the way we look at this amino acid. So why are people saying it's the most abundant amino acid? Well, because it sits around inside the cell. It sits around in the fluid, the sarcoplasm. That doesn't render it useless. It's actually an important effect because it's going to affect the cell volume. Now, this is where we get into the tricks, okay? This is why it's important. If we change our cell volume, the level of water in our cell, sarcoplasm, it looks and feels like real muscle. This is why creatine is so effective, right? It looks and feels like real muscle. Muscle is mostly water to begin with, right? Just sitting around inside. So if we change that volume, we can have potential impacts on catabolism, muscle growth, recovery, that kind of thing. So this is where the potential benefit of glutamine comes into play. This is where it gets exciting. Now, the reason it doesn't work right now is because we have more than enough glutamine in our cells already. We can't get any more in. So if you've seen my other videos, you know there's a trick to this. So the way this works, you're about to become an expert in cellular physiology, okay? This is the way it works. Imagine you are outside of a club. Let's call it Das Club, okay? There's a massive line. You get to the front of the line and you get velvet roped. The bouncer doesn't let you in. Why? Because there are already way too many people just like you in the club. Club doesn't want any more. It's full. It's saturated. Okay? That's like glutamine. Our cells are already full. It doesn't want any more. Our cells don't want any more inside. Okay? It gets velvet roped. But the trick is, you happen to bring along your very attractive significant other to Das Club. Now, the club and the bouncer, they are desperate to get that significant other in there, but they're not going in without you. So the bouncer has no other choice but to let you in along with your significant other. Now, you've just contributed to the already full, already saturated levels of people just like you. The club is now said to be super saturated. It's extra full. There's way more inside of it. And this is how we get around the barriers to glutamine supplementation, the barriers to glutamine getting into our cells. We have to find a way to super saturate the cell, and then there's potential for it to have an anti-catabolic or anabolic muscle growth, recovery, adaptation response. So tip number one, I mentioned this in my beta-alanine video. I will link to that in the top right. Talked about this a bit in the creatine video. I'll also link to that a little bit later. This is the key, using sodium and chloride. I was working with an athlete named Sean. Guy was what's known as a salty sweater, sweat like crazy, wasn't responsive to creatine, and sure enough, part of the fix was adding sodium and chloride to his drink with the creatine. And it's not going to fix everything, but creatine is co-transported with sodium and chloride. A lot of amino acids are as well. So without those extra significant others, the attractive significant others, it's going to be harder to get into the cell or Das Club, using the analogy. So especially if you're a salty sweater, if you sweat a lot during training, especially summer months, humid environments, adding that sodium and chloride is actually going to have a small benefit to getting stuff inside your cells, including potentially, we hope, glutamine. Now, speaking of other supplements, the idea of using glutamine and creatine together, this is number two. If you're looking for that cell volumization, the number one way to get this is going to be creatine. So it really seems to a lot of you, I'm sure, what the hell, you're recommending creatine with glutamine? Come on. But I've seen way too many diets where people are afraid of creatine, so they focus on glutamine because they don't understand the potential of how it's going to work. So if you're using glutamine, if you're looking for that cell volumization, use creatine with it, okay? Creatine is the most powerful cell volumizer we have. It's the one that's really going to have a massive impact. And then if we can get glutamine to have an impact on top of that, that's the icing on the cake. But start with creatine, okay? You can use creatine and glutamine together, but start with the creatine if you're not using it already. That's going to have the biggest impact. Then you throw in your glutamine, throw in your sodium and chloride, and you're going to have a more powerful impact. Quick FAQ people have about glutamine. This applies to pretty much any supplement. Why do so many people disagree about whether or not glutamine is effective? Again, this could apply to anything, and it's a really good question. And it comes down to the fundamental problem. People are having opinions. People are having subjective opinions. So to be a more fundamental question is, why are people having subjective opinions when we have objective evidence to rely on? And it doesn't mean that the objective evidence is dogma, but it is by far the best information that we have to go on. So why would our subjective perception override that? It's absolutely bizarre. If somebody has an opinion about gluten, I mean, we're not talking about their favorite food, right? We're not talking about their favorite car, their favorite color. Those cool, subjective perceptions all day long. We can discuss that, have some fun, maybe not, but it's one of those things. Subjective perception, your opinion doesn't matter. It's really about what does the objective evidence show. Again, this applies to every supplement. So you will see people having all kinds of reactions, performing all sorts of mental gymnastics to try to rationalize. People will pull out stuff on PubMed that is 20, 30 years old related to cells in a dish, cells in a test tube, or animal stuff. Well, once we have that human research, that gold standard research, that is the best information that we have to go on. Okay, we're not talking abstracts, which is a whole other trick the supplement industry uses. Let's stick with PubMed, let's stick with the gold standard research that we have available, and we can extrapolate when needed, but let's dispense with the nonsense of special feelings and subjective perceptions when we in fact have that objective evidence to go on. Tip number 3, and there's a trick to this. This comes along with using glutamine and BCAAs. You can use them together, no question, but you have to use them when you're otherwise fasted, because we're talking about increasing the blood levels independent of other types of amino acids that are going to compete for transport. Everybody's fighting to get into Das Klub. We don't want that. Okay, we need the line to be clear. We need full access to the amino acids like creatine, glutamine, the branch chains, that kind of thing. So dumping glutamine into your protein shake, that's not where it's at. That's not going to do anything. The research is pretty clear on that. Again, if you like it, I don't care, just keep doing it. But it's one of those things, if you're really trying to affect change, if you're really trying to enhance body composition, muscle growth, fat loss, recovery, athletic performance, it's one of those things you're going to need to follow these tips in sequence. Use it when you're fasted. Okay, first thing in the morning is the best way to do it. Now there is an exception to being fasted, and there are a few other amino acids you can use with it. Like I said, creatine, okay, it's not an amino acid, it's close enough amino-based structure. Beta-alanine is a great example. You can use branch chains, we mentioned. Now the trick is you want to use it with a massive dose of carbs, 70 to 80 grams of fast absorbing carbs. This is going to get you an insulin spike. It's going to drive this stuff into muscle. Not all amino acids are responsive to this, but certain things like creatine, carnitine, likely glutamine in terms of its transporters, going to be stimulated to get this stuff inside muscle. Potentially is going to help super saturate that muscle. This is based on some of my research experience for NASA at the Johnson Space Center. This is based on other research I did using a radioactive poison. Again, I talk about this in that creatine video. This is going to be the basis of my 4th book. I'll link to it down in the description when it's available. But ultimately, it's about super saturating our cells to get that anti-catabolic effect. This is going to affect recovery, muscle growth, performance, adaptation, that kind of thing. So there's a really simple way to do it. We're talking about it. Sodium and chloride is a big part. A massive carb dose to give you a massive insulin spike to drive that stuff into muscle. That's the key, because again, we're talking about getting into Das Klub. Your cells don't want anymore. You have to find a way to override that. Okay, so we're using something called an ionic override, using ions to help facilitate that process. Get more of the stuff in muscle so it can do its job. Tip number 5 comes back to something I call anabolic correspondence. It's developed from the late Professor Verkhoshansky's dynamic correspondence. And a quick sidebar, if you are looking for a more advanced training book, if you're kind of tired of the standard meathead books, I definitely recommend this guy. This is one of his fundamental books. It's a Russian manual. It's translated from Russian, so it's a little more challenging to read, but it's not really bad. If you're a little more advanced in your career, it's something I definitely recommend you pick up. Extrapolating the concept of dynamic correspondence. Basically, for this anabolic correspondence, it's about anabolic specificity, or training the way that we're going to cause the greatest level of adaptation, and it's specific to the type of adaptation we're after. So if we're after increased muscle growth, increased strength, that kind of thing, this is where we're going to want to train specific to those goals. What are those stimuli? We know the adaptive response. What are the actual adaptive stimuli that are going to cause that? Well, this is part of my 5th book, which again, I'll link to down in the description when it's actually published. But specifically with regard to glutamine, we are going to want to train higher volume, higher rep. So that 10 to 12 rep range, higher volume, slightly shorter rest periods, because we're not looking to induce mechanical stress for the most part. We are looking for a metabolic stress, also known as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Okay, this is where we're going to have that stress on the enzymes, going to have a stress induced by potentially lack of substrate, high levels of metabolites. Okay, this is going to get us that sarcoplasmic or cell volume hypertrophy that we're after. If you haven't heard of this, don't worry about it. I'm going to cover it in more detail in future videos, say top tips for muscle growth. I'll link to that in the description once that's published. I'll even throw a card up in the top right once that gets out there. But the idea is to be specific. We can't just train how we want and expect supplements to do exactly what we want them to. We have to understand what they do physiologically at the biochemical level and then tailor our training towards that if we want that specific effect. Again, this is anabolic correspondence or anabolic specificity, so we need to be more specific with regard to what we're doing. In this case, we're after volume, we're after more stuff inside the muscle, so that's going to be about that metabolic stress. That's what we're trying to do. So again, high volume, moderate loads, low rest periods. That's really going to help facilitate that. So now here's your 3-point checklist you can use to decide whether or not you want to use glutamine. First is looking at banned substances and purity testing. Look for companies like BSCG, Informed Choice, or Informed Sport if you're in Europe. NFHS, what's the other one? NSF is another big one. And don't just look at the label. If you're actually going to invest money in this, if you're going to actually put this in your body and you're concerned about purity and banned substances, look at the website of the company, okay? So again, NSF, BSCG, Informed Choice, or Informed Sport, just some examples. And the reason is, supplement companies can actually put the logo of those testing companies on their product. It's kind of sketchy if they don't actually pay for it, if they don't actually do the testing. It has happened before. I asked about this during an NSF webinar, and the rep for the company indicated, yeah, they're doing the best they can with regard to investigating different companies, making sure the products are clean, making sure that companies that don't support the testing don't slap the testing label, the purity testing label on their product. But it's not foolproof. Some people can get away with it. I've seen this firsthand. And it's one of those things you just need to be careful, especially if you're an athlete. Check the testing company's site. Number 2 is going to be longevity. How long has this stuff been around? And the reason is because most stuff is a flash in the pan. I mean, 1 in 1,000 supplement ingredients have actual evidence of efficacy, effectiveness, that kind of thing. So it's really rare that for something to stick around for a long time when it actually has evidence of not working. And that's where glutamine comes into play. Unfortunately, it's been around forever, and we just have a great track record of it not doing anything. You can tell because people will report on it saying it's great, and then they're not using it 6 months later, or they will come out and acknowledge, okay, yeah, it didn't actually work for me, it was just placebo effect. And it's one of those things, the vociferous nature, the intensity of their belief that it works is no indicator of actual effectiveness. We tend to believe people more when they get more excited and more worked up by things. It's not a measure of actual efficacy or effectiveness, okay? It just means they're shouting the loudest. It means that they have the least amount of emotional control, so to speak. So just be careful with that, and we can just keep advancing the conversation. Number 3, this is the big one. Proof, or more specifically, proof on PubMed. Okay, it's not dogma, but it is by far the best evidence that we have, and we now have that top level gold standard evidence of not just proof on PubMed, but using humans and resistance training, healthy humans and their strength training. And unfortunately, it doesn't do anything. That's why we're trying to fix glutamine, right? If you love it, just keep using it. I've said this before. I'm not trying to take it away from you. Just make sure you have the best information with which to make your ultimate decision. With regard to glutamine dosing and timing, again, the timing is more contingent on being fasted. Doesn't matter if it's around a workout. There's a way to do it using carbohydrates, BCAAs, creatine, that kind of thing. I'll cover that in the book, and I do cover that in the other videos that I link to. But it's one of those things, the timing really isn't matter as long as you're fasted and using the other components with it. Okay, dosing, I just use 5 grams myself. There's no real evidence on a specific dose. I just happen to use 5 grams. I've already got a lot of stuff in my drink. I don't want to add too much more amino load, so I just stick with 5 grams. If you're not using a lot of other stuff, you can use more, but I really don't think there's a point to it. And it's one of those things, you can use it every drink. You can use it on off days. It doesn't matter. We're still figuring it out. And I use it on workout days. I can use it in the mornings on non-workout days. It really doesn't matter. It's more like creatine. Once you super saturate to a degree, you're not going to get any more in. So you're really just at maintenance. So you can think of it as a loading maintenance thing. But again, you can use it with your BCAAs and your creatine. Hope you found this video helpful. You know someone else who could use it, share it with them. They just might owe you a protein shake. I'm David Barr, and until next time, raise the bar.